Well, you already know my name, Nate Schutta. I work for Pivotal. Best way to describe me is architect as a service. Is everything is as a service today. And I'll admit that the first time someone called me that, I thought, yeah, that's about right. Because, I go places, I talk to people about architecture. But I will admit I sounded out the acronym in my head and realized it may not have been intended as a compliment. If you are interested in this, and I assume you are because you're hanging out with me here at the end of the day on a Friday, and you're like, I don't remember what he said, just go get the ebook version of this talk. Right, so it's the prose variant that goes along with what I'm going to discuss here this afternoon. And I've been in this architecture space a long time. In fact, I've certainly done architecture work longer than I've had the title. And I realized shortly after I officially got sort of blessed with that title that it's actually a hard job. You end up having to deal with competing agendas and the politics of your organization, and technology change becomes front and center in your life. Now, I don't think this is a particularly brilliant statement. If you've been in our industry more than about 5 minutes, you're aware of the fact that technology changes all the time. This is a feature, not a bug. Now, I will admit, when I first got out of university, I was somewhat despondent because I'd missed some technology wave, and I thought, oh no, that was my one chance to get in on the ground floor. And of course, now I realize technologies are like a bus. Another one will come along in 10 or 15 minutes. And of course, with experience, you start to say, you know what, I'm not actually interested in that one. I'm going to let that go by. I've seen that movie. I know how it ends. Now, I like the fact that there's new things for us to play with because it keeps things interesting. Now, the big challenge that we face as senior engineers, senior technologists, principal engineers, architects, whatever your title happens to be, we don't want to be on legacy platforms. None of us wants to be the last company on insert old technology here. But we have to be very aware of the fact that I can't change something every few months because I read about something on Twitter. That's not going to work either. If we're not careful, we end up, one of my students, she came to me a couple years ago and said, my app has 4 different UI frameworks in it now. Now, I completely understand where the second one came from. We need to make a change. The old one can't do this, the new one can. I'm fine with that. It's the third one where someone needed to stand up and say, stop. And it's the fourth one where someone literally should have flipped a table. Now, I get why this happened. Developers kept finding new toys and were like, I want to play with that, whereas I like to refer to it resume-driven development. And so we have to be very cautious here because that's not where we need to be. And there's one thing I can guarantee you're going to have to do in your career. You're going to have to evaluate new technologies. Someone actually had a great tweet. I did this little lightning talk this morning about microservices and why we need to use them responsibly. And someone said, use them where they make sense. And I thought, what, this is just yet another instance of technology change, which it is. I don't know what's coming next. I'm sorry, I don't have that predictive ability. None of us does. But there's one thing I'm very comfortable with. The future will be different from today. 5 years from now, we're probably going to be using something that hasn't even been invented yet. Now that leads us to the first step here, which is we're always in this industry of chasing new things. And again, I don't think this is a brilliant statement. We all realize that. It comes with the territory. And it's very tempting for us to always be chasing the new thing, to always be on the bleeding edge. And I find this somewhat ironic because please tell me some other part of your life where you desperately want to be on the experimental branch. Example from my own life, I had my hip replaced earlier this year. And when I met with my surgeon about a year and a half ago, I assure you, if I'd have walked into his office and he said, oh, Nate, thank goodness you came in today. Listen, I was just on Twitter reading about this new experimental way of fixing hips. Can I do it to you? I would have backed out of the room. I would have found a different surgeon. And yet we do this all the time. And I get it because it's fun. And it is a very important part of being in this industry. I am very much of the opinion the most important skill you have to have is learning new things. The way we hire in this industry is just backwards. We get so fixated on this checklist. Instead of saying, can you learn new things? Please demonstrate to me how you've learned new things. One of my colleagues was talking to me earlier this year and he's telling me that both of his children are in college. They're both studying computer science. I said, do they realize they've signed up for a lifetime of learning? He just laughed and said, no, not yet. But that's the reality for all of us. Education is one of these things that just keeps going on, especially in our line of work. And of course, the real irony here is our understanding is constantly going through this evolution. It's not a static thing by any stretch. There's a great thread from Ben Evans on this. He says, there's things that you understand well enough where, you've got a strong opinion, and there's things where you just know what other people's opinions are, and there's things where you can't really have an opinion at all. And of course, in technology, there's things you're just starting to play with. There's things you're an expert on. There's things you used to be an expert on, but you haven't worked with for quite some time. I used to do a lot of JavaScript. That was probably 4 or 5 years ago, which is like a lifetime in software. Now, I'm not the right person to give you the should I use Angular or React. Actually, someone asked me that this summer, and I said, well, here's the easiest way to find out. Build the application with React, then build it again with Angular, and throw away the one you don't like. Obviously, that's never going to work in the real world. They're never going to let us re-implement it twice, but that's the best way to figure this stuff out. Now, let's be honest. If you've ever been in a project room, you are painfully aware of how opinionated we are as a species. As developers, we often have very strong opinions. Does anyone want to debate tabs versus spaces with me? Do you guys ever watch Silicon Valley? Have you seen that show? You remember the episode where the kind of lead character breaks up with this woman over tabs versus spaces? I remember watching that. I about fell off the couch because I thought that was so funny. And my wife, who's a business analyst, just was like staring at me like, I don't get it. Why is this funny? And so then I attempted to explain it to her. It got no funnier for her. All right? That's the beauty of humor. If you have to explain it, it actually gets worse. Now, one of the things that I've noticed throughout my career is a lot of developers will come to me and say, Nate, we have to use this technology. I'm like, great. Why? And they repeat the name of the technology to me. Like, that's good. You know the name, but we have to move beyond that. But for so many of us, that's where we stop. We're like, ooh, this is a shiny new toy. I want to play with the shiny new toy. I guess I'll figure out a reason to use it later. Now, the other important part of this is we seem to have a rather healthy fear of the old. And I'm not always sure why that happens. Although I think for many of us, early on in our career, someone kind of takes us under their proverbial wing and basically says, make sure you don't have a legacy skill set so that you can get a new job, or if this company goes south, no problem, you're going to land on your feet. And my favorite example of this, frankly, I worked with this guy very early on in my career who had the retirement countdown screensaver going. And so I was not at all surprised when that thing hit 0 and we had his bon voyage party. But I was a little surprised to run into him in the building about 6 months later. And I said, Dick, what are you doing here today? Did you come in to have lunch with somebody? And he said, oh, Nate, it's the darndest thing. I'm working 3 days a week and they're paying me more than when I was a full-time guy. I thought, well, that's great, you jackass. How do I get that job? I want to work less, get paid more. And he had a very legacy skill set, legacy in quotes, right? He knew COBOL and JCL and Telon and DB2 and IMS and knew where all the skeletons were because he put most of them in the code base. And so he took this legacy skill set and turned it into a pretty nice contract. So sometimes that is the right answer, is to just use the old thing. That's fine. Now, I think the other part of this is when you start to have experience, you start to recognize how we're repeating ourselves. You hear the echoes of the past. And you start to go, wait a minute, this is like that thing we used to do. And you can say, well, you know what? It didn't work then. It's still not going to work now because reasons. Or, that constraint that we had before is now gone. So maybe it will work this time. This is one of my favorite threads talking about this stuff, and he said, there's this fear of old because we always think the old is arcane and complex, and the new is simple and elegant. But the reality is, in so many instances, the new is unfinished, buggy, and unproven, and the old is stable and refined and tested. My favorite example of this is JUnit. I mean, how old is JUnit? I'm quite certain it can legally drink in every country. And yet, if you came to me on our next Java project, and said, oh, we're not using JUnit, and I said, well, that's interesting. Why? And you said, well, because it's old. That doesn't seem like a great justification. Now, if you want to argue that some other tool is better, easier, you like it more, that's fine. Now, I have noticed there's a very predictable hype cycle in our industry, and I've seen this time and time and time again. And luckily for me, my friend and colleague Kote tweeted this out. He said, wow, this technology is amazing. Year 2, actually, this is pretty hard to use, am I right? Year 3, actually, you should probably never use this, especially if you're just trying to do this simple thing. Year 4, ooh, look, machine learning and blockchain. Rinse, repeat. Now, my only quibble with Kote is that it's not measured in years. It's measured in months or weeks, sometimes days. Now that does lead us down this really interesting question. Where should we not use the technology? And I thought that was fascinating that was one of the questions in the last session. When should I not use this? And that's a hard thing for us to answer, especially when something is new. And let's be honest, the way we ultimately learn is trial and error. This is something that I think we sort of forget about, especially as we get older. And if any of you have kids and they're school age, one of the most typical things for us to do when they get home from school is say, hey, how was your day? And depending on the age of your kid, you're probably going to get some kind of non-answer that might be a little more than a grunt. My child is 12, so he's starting to enter these teenage years. And so that's usually what I get, is kind of a noise out of him when he comes home. And somebody explained this to me. So, well, think about it. Our kids spend all day at school failing. This is one of those conversations I've actually had to have with my son. He's like, Dad, I'm really frustrated. I don't understand how to do this. And I said, I understand. I hear you. Here's the thing, though. If you already knew how to do that one, we just give you something harder. That's education in a nutshell. Figure out where you break and go to that point. And so the way we figure this stuff out is by trying it, failing, trying it, failing, trying it, failing. Now I get it. And so the best way to describe this, interestingly enough for me, is to use a Calvin and Hobbes cartoon. So my son discovered Calvin 4 or 5 years ago, which is great because now I've had an excuse to reread every Calvin strip 50 times. And there's one that absolutely explains what we do in software engineering. And it's this one right here. How do they know the load limit on a bridge, Dad? Well, they just drive heavier and heavier trucks over the bridge until the bridge falls down, then they weigh the last truck and rebuild the bridge. This is exactly what we do. Is Mongo a good choice for this project? I have no idea. Let's try it and find out. Will our website support 10,000 concurrent users? I have no idea. Let's try it and find out. That is the nature of what we're doing. And that's the hard part. It's very easy to come up with justifications for we should use this technology. It is much more important, and to me, this is the maturity level we need to get to, is when should we not use that technology? That's how you can really tell whether somebody really gets it, whether they've worked with it long enough to know where the rough edges are. Now, let's be honest. Developers do have a tendency to get bored rather quickly, and I don't know what's cause and effect. I don't know if we get into this industry because we have short attention spans, if being in this industry gives us short attention spans, but we're kind of dogs chasing squirrels. And it's like, ooh, machine learning, oh, blockchain, oh, whatever it happens to be. And we just keep chasing after it. And I get that because it is fun. But here's the reality. We have to deliver business value. I have to get code to production. And I just can't do that if I'm constantly experimenting, constantly trying new things. Eventually, we have to commit and we have to develop some expertise. And as I always like to remind people, if you are on the bleeding edge, by definition, you will bleed. We have to keep that in mind. Now, I like this tweet because it's a reminder that, we play with these things and then they make a change and our code breaks and we all tear out our hair and go, why? And this is why currency gets kicked to the curb all the time. And this has happened to every one of us. I actually had somebody, this was last summer, was debating me about some technology or another, and they said, oh, I really hate it. And I said, well, why is that? And he said, we've had nothing but trouble with it. I said, well, hang on, when did you start working with it? He said, about 6 months ago. I said, you realize it just went 1.0 2 weeks back. So if you started working with it 6 months ago, that was by definition when it was 0.4. So yes, of course things are going to change. How do you know who the pioneers are? Well, they're the ones with the arrows in their back. And for us as technologists, we have to be strategic. Because yes, avoid the dead platforms. But you can't be the technology equivalent of a hummingbird just sort of flitting from one thing to another. We have to be strategic. Now, a lot of companies try to use hope as a strategy. I'm sorry, hope is not, in fact, a strategy. The nicest thing I can say about hope is it is what rebellions are built on. We have that going for us. We have to be deliberate. This is one of the big challenges we face in our industry because there are a lot of bits out there. Every time I turn around, it seems like there's a new language, a new technique, a new approach. And it puts us in this position where we have to keep up. How? A lot of this is your own learning style. Maybe you read blogs or books, you follow people on Twitter, you can go to podcasts. You guys spend some time with us. That's fantastic. So it's all your own individual learning approaches, but it has to be an ongoing thing. This is not one and done. When I first got out of college, I had a manager, and I was talking to her one day, and I said, why did you get out of technology? Why did you become a manager? And she said, well, I got tired of having to constantly learn new things. I got tired of being on the technology merry-go-round. And I didn't completely understand that at the time. I was a little offended as well. I thought, so there's like nothing new to learn on how to manage people? That seems odd. But I get it now because there's been so many technologies that have come and gone in my career. I understand where she's coming from. Now, the trick for us is this can't be a one-off. It has to be a routine, a habit. And maybe that's Friday afternoon. I'm very much of the opinion anyone who puts a meeting on your calendar for Friday afternoon has committed a hostile act. Now, maybe that's unavoidable because of schedules, or maybe you have a particularly sadistic manager. So maybe it's Tuesday over lunch. Maybe it's Thursday morning. I don't know. Whatever works for you. I am personally a big fan of what I've referred to as morning coffee. Insert your favorite drink here, whether that's tea or water or energy drink, whatever. But you take that first 15, 20, 30 minutes in the morning and you peruse the news, whatever that means for you. Twitter, InfoQ, Reddit, whatever makes you happy. But it's got to be a first thing in the morning thing. You have to do it before your day gets away from you. Because every one of you has had that joyful experience. You're on your way into the office, you're like, oh, today, finally, I'm going to get to 1, 2, and 3 on my priority list. And then contact with the enemy happens, and that gets thrown out the door. And by the end of the day, you're heading home, and you're just exhausted, and you're like, I was so busy that I don't even know what I did today, but it sure as heck wasn't 1, 2, and 3 on my list. So it has to be a regular occurrence. I was a big fan when I worked at Enterprise of always having blocks on my calendar. I would be happy to schedule over them if I had to, but I wanted to have there be some spots where I could actually just stop and think. Because if you let your calendar go free, people will schedule every single second of your day. Attention is the most precious resource you have. And as my friend Michael Nygaard tweeted out, it is a resource. It does not scale. There is a finite amount of it. One of my all-time favorite quotes, attention's like real estate. They're not making any more of it. The big difference is the value of your attention keeps going up. If you don't think your attention is valuable, ponder for a second how many billion-dollar corporations exist to capture and monetize your attention. Those cat videos will not watch themselves. I actually saw the most meta cat thing ever. It was this post about people who said they'd never get a cat, and then a year later or whatever, now they have a cat. And like the second one was this gentleman who said, oh, I'm never going to get a cat. And then here's his cat on his lap, and he's showing the cat videos. I thought, that's like, I think the internet truly is just cats all the way down now, or cat videos, right? Please do not waste your attention. You have to be selective. I'm sorry, you cannot read it all. In fact, you're probably going to miss almost everything that gets produced. There was a point in time in human history where you actually could have read everything. The great irony is in that point in time in human history, you probably were illiterate. Sorry. Now, I've struggled with this. I used to subscribe to a lot of magazines. That's basically like the internet, except it's been printed out and bound. And I've let almost all of my subscriptions lapse because I just wasn't reading them. They'd basically pile up on the island in my kitchen, and I would walk by the pile, and the pile would fall over. And my wife would give me a look that suggests now is an excellent time to go through the pile. And so I've let almost all of those lapse, including there's one that I think I subscribed to for almost 20 years. And like the third renewal notice came in, and my wife was like, are you sure? I'm like, yeah, it's okay. I've got a year's worth right there, so I think I'm good. Now, what I always used to fear is I would miss something. Something important would happen, and I wouldn't hear about it. Here's the reality. You will hear about it if it's a big enough deal. You may not care about Apple at all. You may have never bought an Apple product ever, but you're probably aware that Apple shipped new phones in the last few weeks. You're probably somewhat aware that they also put out a new computer this summer that you tick enough boxes and it costs more than a pretty nice car. I think what I saw is it'll go up to like 4 terabytes of memory. Can you imagine that? That's a lot. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when if you had like 32 megs of RAM, it's like, ooh, what are you going to do with all that? I think, though, we need that just to run Slack, so it's probably okay. I think that's ultimately why they've ramped that up. I'm not sure. Here's the challenge for us. I can't adopt every new thing, but I now have to figure out where should I invest my time? What makes sense for me, my company, my team? Some people would argue, well, you get an instinct for this. And so Paul Graham wrote this piece a number of years ago. I used to refer to it as Hacker's Radar. And he lays out actually some really good things to look at when you're evaluating a new technology. And he basically says, once you have enough experience, you just sort of have a gut instinct for this. And he goes on to say in that particular piece, well, I have a hunch that Java won't be a very successful language. Now, we obviously have the value of hindsight, and we can look back and say, ha, 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 how wrong could that be? I don't know where Java is in the top 5 most successful languages of all time. That's a fascinating debate that I recommend we have during the after party here tonight. Here's the interesting part about that. He's never actually written any Java, but he flipped through a few books, and that was enough to give him this hunch that Java wouldn't be successful. So that might not be enough for us. However, I will say judging covers can be a very useful filter. Years ago at my organization, somebody brought in this new WYSIWYG drag and drop tool, and I was admittedly a little put off by it, at least partially because when the person who came in to train us on it in the very first training session said, and the best thing about our product is you don't need any programmers. And he said that to a room full of programmers. I thought, please read the room, dude. And so I was definitely put off. One of my colleagues thought it was great, and so I was talking to him one day, and I said, well, hang on a sec here. How do you do a diff? And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, this is all visual drag and drop, so how do you tell what I changed after you put this in? He said, well, I guess you could do a screen capture and do a visual compare. I said, well, that's great. And I said, okay, well, how do I write an automated test for this? And he said, oh, that's the best part. You don't have to, because you can't make mistakes. I thought, okay, that's all I need to know. I don't want to go anywhere near this. Now, we have to be cautious about bias, though, because bias is a real thing. We had a bad experience, and we let that carry through. Every one of you has had a bad experience with JavaScript at some point. It might have been 10 years ago. It might have been 5 years ago. It might have been on, Tuesday. And so we have to be cautious about that because the language is changing. It's getting better. And so if we let a bad experience from 5 or 10 years ago sort of color the way we look at it today, we might be missing out on something. We need to think about the community. Where are my people at? But we have to watch out for the lemming effect. I've seen far too many people say, we have to use this. Why? Well, because I read this white paper about how this company is using it, so we have to do it too. Okay, well, do you have the same constraints that they have? Do you have the same forces, the same context? Just because it was really successful for company X doesn't mean it's the right choice for you. Are you skating to where the proverbial puck was? I've seen this time and time again. Well, we have to do this because that's next in the order. No, you can skip steps. That's okay. Now, I'm a huge fan of the technology Radar. This is an artifact that comes out of ThoughtWorks on a semi-regular basis. Every time one of these comes out, there's always something new and interesting. I'm like, oh, well, that's kind of cool. And it sort of takes the experience across lots and lots of projects around the world and bubbles it up through a group of really smart people. I think it's too bad that Google's 20% time has sort of fallen out of favor. But that to me was an excellent relief valve to give people a chance to play and experiment and try things. Oh, you want an excuse to use Kotlin? Great. Go do that on your side project and report back to us. I had somebody this summer ask me, how do I convince my manager that we should use Go on our next project? And I said, well, has your company had any experience with Go to date? And he said, yeah, we had 3 projects use it and all the projects failed. Now, I'm not suggesting they failed because they chose Go. I think that's an unfair assumption to make. It's possible they failed for completely unrelated reasons. But unfortunately for this person, he's got a tough road ahead of him here. There's a chance management has already so soured on it because 3 projects failed. Why'd they fail? Well, the only thing we did different is we used this new language, ergo new language is to blame. So we have to be cautious about that. Having side projects is very useful for figuring out where does it fit, where doesn't it fit, and we don't have the risk of actual real live projects failing. Now, a lot of companies have at least embraced this idea of Innovation Fridays. It does not have to be every Friday, but you give developers a chance to play and experiment and try things out. It might be one Friday a month. It might be one Friday a quarter. Maybe it's Friday afternoon. Maybe it's a regular Tuesday tech talk. Or as one of my friends likes to call them, architectural briefings, which is just a fancy way of saying someone goes and does some research and then presents it back to the team. And no, you do not need to be an architect to do this. We want to get into why should we use this thing? What do we need to know in order to answer the why? What do you need to know in order to use the thing? I want to stress these should be short. This should not be an all-day affair. Half an hour, 20 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour. This is not the deep dive how-to, but we do want to get beyond hello world. This also needs to be two-way traffic. Attendees should be taking notes, asking good questions, bringing their own experience to bear. Do you agree? Do you disagree? And by the way, you should do one of these in the future as well. Now, if we pass the briefing filter, it's time for us to roll up our sleeves, get our hands dirty, and actually do a workshop. I strongly advise you to do that within the constraints and the context of your environment. I had a student in a workshop last year who told me that they kind of hit this inflection point and they needed to change their UI technology. And so they kind of did a survey of the field, decided, these are the three we like best. And they went off and they did sort of 3 little proof of concepts, totally greenfield, came back, made a decision. And then 6 months later realized, oh, wow, we can't just sprinkle this onto our existing environment. Oops. And he admitted we kind of got caught up in the hype and the excitement around it. And we're going to have to rethink that decision. We might have to scrap it entirely. I'm convinced if they would have done that essentially in a fork of their existing code base, they would not have run into those issues. They would have discovered that much, much sooner. And they could have said, are we willing to do the refactoring work necessary to make this work? Or are we moving on to something else? So give yourself a couple hours, a couple days. You're never going to get enough time for this. So you need to make sure that you've identified the key use cases that matter most for you in your environment. Run people through some exercises, make the setup as simple as possible. If we get past the hands-on filter, it's time to trial it somewhere in our organization. We want a real project that's a good fit to see what happens when this encounters production. That's what matters, though. It has to be a good fit. It can't just be, square peg, round hole, give me a bigger hammer. This rarely should be the bet the company project, by the way, because there is a chance this will fail. And so we need to be aware of the consequences of that. Now, we definitely need to be eyes up, what's coming, what's new, but we also need to realize currency is a real thing for us. The bugs we're seeing now are getting deeper and deeper, and the impacts are massive. They are causing companies to lose valuation, people to lose their jobs. Amazingly, we're not learning from this, though. This vulnerable software is still being used by a lot of companies. Every time I turn around, there's a new largest hack ever. And I think the biggest one that I know of, at least to date, I'm sure this will be eclipsed by the time this video is published, was $500 million from Starwood, aka Marriott. One of my friends is a security guy, and I was talking to him this summer, and I said, Aaron, is there any chance my information is not available on the dark web? And he just laughed. He said, do you want to go find it? I'm like, no. I don't want to know what parts of the interwebs that you have to deal with, my friend. Now, if you don't think you're a target, they've taken this map down. At least last time I looked, it was down. But it will keep you awake at night if you realize how often your systems are being pinged. One of the other speakers and I were talking about this yesterday on the ride over in the car. He said, oh yeah, my router gets pinged every 20 or 30 seconds from China or from Russia, from all sorts of various countries. I thought, oh, that's lovely. And that's why we're starting to see a change in our approach to security, and that's this notion of rotate, repave, repair. For a long time, our approach to this was don't touch anything, don't breathe on it, it works. And we realized actually that's really dangerous because it gives our adversaries all this time to just sit in our data centers and do what they're going to do. Whereas if we're going fast, if we're constantly repairing, repaving, and rotating, that starves them of the resources they need to do damage. So we need to think about our patching strategy. We need to know what version of a thing would you say you're on. Now, I've been at companies where we had policies that said, you must be at N or N-1. The policy is easy. It's measuring it and enforcing it that's harder. Years ago, I was doing an architectural review of one of our projects, and I said, what version of that library are you using? And the lead architect said, 4.3. I said, congratulations, you're N-2. I have to mark you yellow. He said, what? I said, you're N-2. Since when? 3 months ago. I said, well, I didn't know. I said, I sent out 6 emails. Was I supposed to come to your project room and inform you? Apparently the answer was yes. So even as the reviewing architect, I had no power to stop them. I could just mark them yellow. I don't know if they ever fixed that. For all I know, that's still running in production today with something that's now like N-12. So we need to think about that. And that's a cultural problem. And culture is hard. Culture is where good ideas go to die. Culture gets formed very early on in a corporation's existence. You literally hire, attract, retain based on corporate culture. I understand how hard that is to change. It takes years. But ask yourself what you'd rather do. Try to change your culture or be the next largest hack ever. Now, as an architect, senior technologist, we have to understand pros and cons. We have to be the adults in the room. Because literally every choice we make involves trade-offs. If someone comes to you and says, this is the most amazing thing ever, you should immediately ask, what are the trade-offs? This is design in a nutshell. This is architecture in a nutshell. We spend a lot of our times kind of saying, well, on one hand, on the other hand, to paraphrase Harry Truman, please give me a one-handed technologist. Should I use React? Should I use Angular? Should we refactor to microservices? Should it be on-prem? Should it be in the public cloud? I've done this long enough to realize there's 3 answers that work for every question in software engineering. There's 42. That's the geek check. See who's well read. My favorite thing to say as an architect is, well, another layer of indirection. But the answer that I have to give more often than not is, it depends. Now, I don't mean it depends as a way of stopping the conversation. I mean it as a way of beginning the conversation. Tell me more about your environment. Tell me more about what's going on in your world. The reality is that in most cases, it's and not or. And we've sort of been forced to make these sort of like these false dichotomies. Well, you have to use this or that. Not necessarily. In a lot of cases, we need them both. The hard part's knowing when to use which one. Years ago, I brought in React, and we already had Angular. And so my director kind of cornered me one day and said, listen, I'm totally fine with you doing this. It's good to have choices, but your job as an architect is you better make sure people have good guidance on when to use one over the other. That, in a nutshell, is what we're trying to do as architects, senior technologists, principal engineers, lead engineers, whatever your title is. There is no such thing as a perfect technology. Please do not pretend yours is. You must acknowledge the negatives. My favorite way to pull this out of people is I'll ask them a pretty basic question. First and foremost, what do you like about it? This one should be easy. And I'll let you in on a little secret. I don't actually care what you say here. I mean, I do, because I'm a geek and I'm interested in this stuff, but this doesn't tell me much. It's my follow-up that lets me know how deep you are in this technology, which is, what don't you like about it? There's a tool that you use every day that if I tried to take it away from you, it'd be over my cold, dead hands. There's something you change about it, though, isn't there? I use Keynote all the time. I love Keynote. It's great. But there's one thing about Keynote, well, maybe more than one, but one in particular. I can't embed another slide deck inside my slide deck. I reuse slides. I'm a software engineer. And so the idea of me going, oh, wait, that's right, I use that same set of slides in these 3 presentations, I have to remember to go fix them, is annoying. This is a great interview question, by the way, as long as someone's not right out of college. So whatever the language, technology, framework, database, IDE, editor, etc., what would you add? But before you can add that magic new feature, you got to remove something first. What would you do? What does that look like for you? I love this tweet. I think it's almost like required these days to have a Kelsey tweet, but you haven't mastered a tool until you understand when it should not be used. That's the key part here. That's us being responsible in our technology choices. We need to think about how it stacks up to the alternatives. That means we're probably going to use a spreadsheet. Sorry. I hate spreadsheets, although in fairness, my whole life lives in one. That's where my schedule lives. My coordinator made it very clear to me on basically day one that if it's not in your tab, it is not real. Then I made the mistake one day. My wife asked me if I was going to be around for something, and I said, check with Tasha. She didn't like that. Tasha's my coordinator. So that's when I learned that I'm still figuring out how to be, like a husband and be in a relationship. You put your options across the top. You put your criteria down the left. You can certainly weight the criteria to your heart's content, although now you got to figure out what your scale is, and that's usually a number like 1 through 5. Here's the problem with 1 through 5. It does not matter how many times you say 1 is good, 5 is bad, or 5 is good, 1 is bad. Someone reading your evaluation is going to invert your scale. That's why I like to use Harvey balls. That's these guys. How filled in is this particular criteria? How closely does it map? I have found that to be pretty effective. So a hypothetical comparison of Angular and React might look something like this. Now here's the thing. There's no real scientific way to come up with this. You could do the exact same evaluation I did with the exact same criteria and come up with different results. I can move any one of these a quarter point and not lose sleep over it. Now, the challenge that we face is, so which criteria should we use? How should you weigh them? Guess what? That's up to you. And you can absolutely put your thumb on the scale if you want to, but that almost always backfires. Now, one of the challenges that I've discovered as an architect is the fact that I can't, in fact, be everywhere at all times. I used to think my organization had bad architects. This is my previous company. Because, this person would sort of like randomly spin into the project room, draw a bunch of stuff up on the whiteboard, and then like spin out again. And you're like, who is that human tornado? Oh, that's our architect. Oh, I've never seen that person before. And then I became an architect, and like the next day, like 30 products were dropped on my head. And it's like, go fix all this. And so you realize very quickly that you cannot be involved with every decision, but you can establish principles or guardrails or guideposts or North Stars, whatever you want to call them. We are trying to ultimately create an environment within which our projects can thrive. But how do I know if you're doing what I need you to do? We come up with these architectures and we don't think much about testing them. And that's where this idea of fitness functions comes in. We're all familiar with the second law of thermodynamics, otherwise known as a teenager's bedroom. Earlier this year, I can't remember if I was putting something in my son's room or trying to get something out of it, but I came downstairs and I said, wow, I had a hard time finding the floor in there. We should probably ask him to clean his room. And my wife just looked at me and said, what hill do you want to die on today? I said, apparently not that one. The reality is the universe wants to be disordered. Software is not immune from this. Every one of you has started a new project and said, this time, we're going to do it right. And then 3 months later, you're like, what happened? And we do this with architecture. We come up with this architecture, and we don't think much about how to maintain it. And knowing that I can't be there all the time, knowing that I can't be involved in every decision, what am I supposed to do about that? Now, I can't predict the future. I guess the best I can do is study history. Past is prologue, as they say. Although, in fairness, there is one thing that I feel confident in. There's going to be change, which is kind of ironic because we define architecture as the decisions that are hard to change or the decisions we wish we got right. But I know things are going to change. Isn't that, in a nutshell, anti-agile? Is that why we say we're agile, we don't have architects? And by the way, I hear this a lot, or variants on this. Oh, we're agile, we don't have any architects. And I always think that's kind of ironic because whether you have architects or not is irrelevant. You have people making architectural decisions. I hope for your sake they're making good ones. Don't worry, you'll know in a year or two. This is where we end up with 4 UI frameworks. No one could have predicted this. So what do we do about this? Well, maybe we change our assumptions. Maybe we follow Martin's advice. Build for what's in front of us. Choose technology that can evolve and evolve one use case at a time, otherwise known as evolutionary architecture. What if we designed our architectures expecting them to change? That's the core tenet of this book. And if you're looking for something to add to your reading list, I'd put this at the top. The moral of the story is we want an architecture that supports guided incremental change across multiple dimensions. That's what we're striving for here. So no, there is no disconnect between, yes, we can be agile and we can still have good architecture. I'm going to stop there since I know I now stand between you and an after party. And one of the things I've learned is never stand between developers and drinks or developers and lunch. So I will call it a day. I'll be around if you have questions or comments. But thank you so much for your time and attention. Cheers.
All right. Give it up, Nate Schutta, for this very nice closing of Open Slava. I know you don't want to be in between them and the after party, but we still have some questions. So out of courtesy to them for
sure.
Asking them, maybe you can go through them.
Let's see. How can we convince clients to try new things instead of holding on to old platforms? We have to help them understand why it's in their best interest. So we need to put it in their language, their terminology. Doing this will save you time. We can get things done faster. It can do this that our old technology can't. But we have to put it in terms that matter to them. It can't just be about us and technology and, well, because it's the new thing. So that requires us to do the legwork to figure out why it's actually a good choice. How do I avoid hype-driven development? Maturity, honestly. I think that's really what it boils down to. And again, to me, it's similar to what I just said. You need to be able to justify why you're doing this. And it can't just be because, well, again, I saw it on Twitter or Reddit or whatever. We have to understand it deep enough to know, it's a good choice because ABC. Please give this guy a beer. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. But he's truly a stand-up. I'm just pretending to be one to try to get cheap laughs. So,
But you get him.
what is my son's biggest field of interest? Oh, that's a good question. He's kind of getting into music in various ways, shapes, and forms. He's playing guitar. He's also doing viola, and apparently he told my wife he wants like some kind of a DJ mixing thing for Christmas. I don't know. I talked to him yesterday. He said, "Oh, Dad, I found an app. We'll talk about it when you get home." So I guess I'll know more next week. What do I recommend to make technical decisions? That's a good one. Again, to me, it's making sure that we have our story lined up, that we're not just picking it because we want to play with it, that we've actually gone through that process of understanding it's good for this, it's not good for this, it's a good fit because, and that we're actually justifying why we're doing it as opposed to just, I want to put it on my resume. How do we enforce pragmatism? Oh, man. Challenge them. Again, I think to me, it's like, great, that's awesome. You're really excited about this. We want to foster that. Then it's like, okay, what would you add? What would you take away? And they're probably like, I don't know. A great question. And again, this was one we got in the last session, which is awesome. When should you not use this? That's a perfect way to kind of make people think twice, that it isn't just hype. When would you not use this? If they have a bad answer to that, you probably shouldn't use it. Where can we watch more of your talks? Well, I get around. There's no getting around that. Somebody asked me last month, like, where do I live? And I laughed and I said, well, mostly on Delta hardware because I spend a lot of time on airplanes. So I do a lot of conferences. There's no getting around that. As part of my job at Pivotal, if you're working with us, you can always just talk to your rep and say, hey, can Nate come talk to us? And there's a pretty good chance that can happen. It might be a few months out. In fact, I just saw before this, Tasha was pinging me about something and saying, when can we shoehorn this in? I'm like, I don't know. So good times.
All right, cool. I think
Awesome.
That's a nice compliment to end your talk with.
Thank
and a nice
you.
talk to end the conference with. Give him a round of applause, Nate Schutta.
Cheers.
You scored.